policy. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Minister is not worth the crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder. It has now been 10 days and 60 dead British Columbians since the government of that province has asked the Prime Minister to reverse his deadly and radical legalization of crack, heroin, and other hard drugs in children's parks, hospitals, on transit. Why will he not reverse his radical agenda?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Addictions and Health.
Mr. Speaker, communities in BC are facing an extremely serious challenge. It is a toxic drug supply on the streets and people are dying. We know that public consumption is an issue of concern, which is exactly why, Mr. Speaker, BC is amending their proposal, and we have been working with them every step of the way. We're treating this with the urgency it deserves, and all partners are at the table right now, Mr. Speaker, to find the path forward, working with law enforcement and health services so that we get this right and save lives, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, to find a path forward, the path forward is obvious. Ban hard drugs, invest in treatment, bring our loved ones home drug-free. That minister claimed last week that she was waiting for the BC government to provide information before she could decide on reversing radical legalization. It turns out the government had given her that information within hours of the request. She has all the information, so why are her and her radical boss clinging on to this insane policy?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we follow science, we follow healthcare experts, and we follow the information. We are working with BC on a comprehensive amendment to their proposal. This takes collaborative work, Mr. Speaker, to get it right. This is a health issue, Mr. Speaker, not a criminal one. The Leader of the Opposition is misleading Canadians in not recognizing that people need health care. They do not need to be re-stigmatized and criminalized.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Abbotsford Soccer Association wrote a letter entitled "A Cry for Change." Volunteers with the organization have found dirty needles that can puncture innocent children in the playing field. Other BC fields have had women raped and overdose, have found addicts naked, have had pets actually overdose because there's so much drug contamination on the site. What are they thinking over there?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a pilot project was put in place at BC's request. BC now has serious concerns about some aspects of that. We share those concerns and we are addressing them. But I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, I do not think there is a family in Canada that is untouched by the tragedy of opioids. And I think that it is absolutely abhorrent to try to score political points off the pain of Canadians.
Then I have Deputy Member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Speaker, common sense is chasing this finance minister. Just like in Alberta, she's speeding away from it. They've put taxpayers on the hook. $54 billion of taxpayer money is going to go to just in interest to this Prime Minister's doubling of the debt. That means more money is going to bankers, bondholders, and this finance minister's Bay Street buddies than to doctors, nurses, and to the healthcare system. Why doesn't she pump on the brakes on the hypocrisy and let common sense catch up? Introduce a dollar for dollar law so inflation and interest rates can finally come down.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, last week, Moody's reaffirmed our AAA credit rating. These are objective analysts who have pointed out that Canada has the most fiscally responsible plan in the G7. But let's talk for a minute, Mr. Speaker, about hypocrisy. Conservative hypocrisy. Last week, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader wrote an op-ed asking business leaders to attack our budget. I guess that's because he doesn't have the courage to come out and say the truth, which is he stands for those at the top, not regular Canadians.
Government, unlike the government that was in office before 2015, has taken this matter seriously and will continue to do everything necessary, Mr. Speaker, in this regard.
The honourable member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
The Liberal Employment Minister got caught cashing checks from his secret lobbying business. Turns out his own department got lobbied and then gave $10 million out, and the minister himself announced it. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, it's clear they're not worth the cost or that corruption. How much did the minister pocket, and is the government prepared today to announce that they're going to have the RCMP investigate this latest Liberal scandal?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
The minister has, of course, addressed that matter, Mr. Speaker, but let's talk about the member for Leeds Grenville, who in this House, in an alarming way last week, failed to rule out using the notwithstanding clause to deny the right of women to reproductive services in this country. There are 80 members of that caucus who have green or yellow lights from the Campaign Life Coalition.
That's right.
Who is going to be standing up over there to make sure that the rights of women are protected against these conservatives anti-choicers?
The honourable member. Again, I'm going to ask all members, please, to hold their comments until they're recognized by the chair. The honourable member from Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the crime, chaos, drugs, or disorder. It was 10 days ago that the BC government pleaded with this Prime Minister to end this wacko drug policy. There have been 60 overdose deaths since BC begged for this to come to an end. On what day will they finally act and give BC what they're asking for?
Again, I'm going to ask the honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby, please, not to take the floor until he's recognized from doing so. And I know that this is a very difficult issue for many, and so I ask members, please, to listen carefully to the questions and listen carefully to the answers. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we have a very effective collaborative relationship with the province of British Columbia, and it is frankly insulting to the province to suggest that the province needs to beg us for anything. The province has serious concerns about their pilot project. We share their concerns, and we are working collaboratively and effectively to address those concerns. What we're not doing is playing partisan politics with the lives of real people.
The headlines in Quebec again today show that after 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing, which has doubled in his 9 years tenure. It's a disaster about to happen. Organizations are calling for help. There are renters who are contemplating suicide, soon to be forced to live in their van. These are the headlines. After 9 years, why should Quebecers believe the Prime Minister now? The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. Mr. Speaker, I understand this situation is difficult for renters and people who don't have housing, and that's why the government, after discussion and negotiation, has entered into a deal with Quebec to build affordable housing with federal officials. 8,000 to 10,000 affordable housing units will be built. The leader of the Conservative Party is opposed. That's not okay. We need to work with our Quebec counterparts to build affordable housing. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. More expensive promises. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost after 9 years. What's worse, the Bloc voted in favor of $500 billion in inflationary centralizing spendings. That's going to cause interest rates to shoot up. Quebecers will lose their homes, and taxpayers will have to pay even more now on debt service than on health care. When will the Prime Minister recognize that he and the Bloc are not worth the cost? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan to build more housing more quickly, but the Conservatives voted against it. We have a plan for a green industrial transition, but the Conservatives voted against it. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share some big news that Canadians got last week, and that is that our credit rating, our AAA credit rating, the highest possible credit rating, Canada still...
The Honourable Member from Kelowna Lake Country.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the crime, chaos, drugs and disorder. The BC government sent the Prime Minister all the information he needs to end his wacko drug policy experiment. In his 10 days of inaction, it's estimated 60 British Columbians' lives have been tragically lost to overdoses. Wacko drug policies have the RCMP citing government-supplied drugs being diverted, and open drug use of crack in hospital rooms, meth in restaurants, fentanyl in parks and playgrounds. Wow. How many more days will it take this Prime Minister to end his failed drug policy experiment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and of course, all members in this House are absolutely ripped apart by what we're seeing the opioid crisis do across this country. The responsibility that we have to the families who've lost loved ones, to the people who are in crisis right now, is to make sure that we follow evidence. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that the ideas proposed by the Conservatives have been tried and failed everywhere they've been tried. And that if we're going to have honest conversations, holding out false solutions is very disappointing on a subject so sensitive. We need to work collaboratively in an evidence-based way to make sure that we do everything we can to get this right, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, on April 11th, the Prime Minister said that it wasn't simply an overall the election was free and fair, but that in every single constituency election, election integrity held and it was free and fair. Justice Hogue concluded otherwise. She concluded that well-grounded suspicions about PRC interference in Don Valley North could, quote, could have impacted who was elected to Parliament. This is significant, end quote. Does the government agree with Justice Hogue that PRC interference could have impacted who was elected to Parliament in Don Valley North?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we agree with Justice Hogue that there has been an increase in foreign state actors, hostile state actors, seeking to interfere in the Canadian democratic process. Obviously, that takes place at the riding level. We also noted Justice Hogue saying that this is the case for a very small number of constituencies, and she is not able to draw definitive conclusions as to the extent of that impact. So I understand my honourable friend is identifying some of what Justice Hogue said. I think it's important to put it in the context that she herself did.
Yes. The Honourable Member from Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell the government what Justice Hogue concluded in Steveston, Richmond East. She found that, quote, there are strong indications of PRC involvement, and there is a reasonable possibility that these narratives could have impacted the result in this riding. Again, the Prime Minister said just several weeks ago that every single constituency election integrity held, and it was free and fair. Does the government agree with Justice Hogue that PRC interference could have impacted the election result in Steveston, Richmond East?
The The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we think that Justice Hogg has done a very serious job in terms of understanding the extent and nature of foreign interference and helping Canadians understand also the tactics that foreign hostile state actors may use and how they seek to undermine the confidence of Canadians in democracy. So I think we should be very careful, Mr. Speaker, before we take out of context specific things that Justice Hogg has said. Our government, unlike the government that was in office before 2015, has taken this matter seriously and will continue to do everything necessary, Mr. Speaker, in this regard.